Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. So today we're going to be talking about public safety in Minneapolis. And speaking of public safety, last Friday, the Public Health and Safety Committee of the Minneapolis City Council voted 5-1 to move forward with an amendment to the city's charter. Now, if you don't know what a charter is, that's okay. It's basically like a constitution, but for a city. And currently, the charter has a requirement that there be a police department. And this amendment would make it so that requirement for a police department would be replaced by referring to broader language that refers to a public safety department. And this department would, yes, include law enforcement, but could also include other things that contribute to public safety, like violence intervention and violence interruption. And so this is just the first step in a long process to potentially change the charter. There are many other steps that go along with this. So it just passed out of committee. That was this past Friday, or last Friday. Next, tomorrow, it goes to the entire city council. After that, it goes to a charter commission, which we'll explain what that is in a little bit. After that, goes back to the city council, who then presents it afterwards to voters to vote yes or no in the general election. Now, something to note is that the city council has tried to do this before. Let's go back in time to May. The Minneapolis Police Department's killing of George Floyd sparked a national uprising. People were grieving. They took to the streets to demand change. They protested to demand change, and city council listened to those calls. And they developed a proposal to dismantle the police department. But the Charter Commission, which I told you that I would tell you who they were, they are an unelected, unaccountable body whose members are appointed by a judge, rejected that proposed amendment and recommended that it not be referred as a ballot question to voters. They said that there were legal issues. They said that they didn't have enough time to fully consider it. They said that they needed more community engagement. So 3 council members listened to this feedback, went back to the drawing board, and that's why you have the amendment that is in front of you now. But in the meantime, the council also passed an $8 million cut to the department's 2021 budget and reinvested that money into things like a mental health crisis team and additional training for 911 operators. But even those steps face some resistance. In December, Mayor Jacob Frye threatened to veto the entire city budget over its proposed reduction of the Minneapolis Police Department's capacity by about 140 officers. Now, Mayor Frye is up for re-election at the same time when this charter amendment could be up for a vote. It will be interesting to see how that vote goes given his record. But in the meantime, while the city council is doing its part to make sure this question reaches voters, groups like Take Action Minnesota are working to get voter signatures for a related charter amendment, one that would eliminate the requirement that the police department employ a minimum number of officers based on the city's population, and create a Department of Violence Prevention. And so these 2 processes are working hand in hand. You have the signature campaign that is working hand in hand with the city council's charter amendment that is coming up for a vote before the city council. And the death of George Floyd really changed the conversation. And people in Minneapolis are looking for changes to policing. The question is whether or not local government can deliver. So here to talk a little bit more about these efforts and the efforts to tackle policing in Minneapolis, I am so pleased to be joined by our guests today, City Council President Lisa Bender and Sheila Nezhad, Policy Organizer at Reclaim the Block. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Council member, I want to start with you. I tried to explain the process up top, but I do not live in Minneapolis, so I'm sure I got something wrong. Talk to us about the process of submitting a charter amendment into law. I see that there are several ways to do it. Can you explain these different ways and how it's normally worked in the past?
You did a great job of explaining our charter process. The city charter is like our city's constitution. A lot of the rules about the charter, including the establishment of this charter commission, are dictated by state law. So we don't have a lot of control over some elements of the process. last year, the Charter Commission was able to stop this proposal from going to the voters because of a required amount of time that they have to review and send back a recommendation, which is non-binding to the city council. And so it was essentially a pocket veto because of the allowance of that time and how the timing lined up with this proposal. But they won't have that ability this year, whether we are considering and forwarding the city council initiated charter amendment to create a new Department of Public Safety, or the community initiative that you mentioned as well. And so I think having both of them happening in parallel is a great opportunity to engage everyone in Minneapolis in this conversation. I think, as you mentioned, and it's always important to remember that this work stems from the tragic and horrible death of George Floyd at the hands of our police department. But that was just one incident of violence by our police department. And this work had been underway, led by community for many years. And then also the behavior of our police department after George Floyd was killed. Shooting tear gas out the window at peaceful protesters, hitting hundreds of peaceful protesters and journalists with non-lethal marker rounds and paint bullets. We have many lawsuits piling up related to their behavior, has really led to members of our community demanding change. And like a lot of things in local government, this is one incremental step that is as good as we make it. It's as powerful as we make it. It opens up opportunity for the future for us to create more tools to keep our community safe, instead of relying on policing alone to be synonymous or the only way that we approach keeping every member of our community safe.
And you've talked a lot about how, you mentioned how these are efforts that have been underway for a pretty long time. And in talking about that, Sheila, I'd like to turn to you. I know that you're organizing to change the charter in a different way. So how is that sort of accumulation of the past work that you've done, and how is that campaign going?
Yeah, so in our past work, we've worked with the council primarily through the budget process to move money out of policing and into violence prevention, and also into things that get to the underlying conditions that create the need for police in the first place, right? Because we know the majority of crime that happens because people don't have their basic needs met. And yet we put tons of money into punishment and incarceration and not enough into addressing those underlying causes. So what we learned through our organizing is that because of the current charter, we're locked into funding the police department at this high level because of the minimum requirement, and because it's institutionally, like Council President Bender said, our primary mode of creating safety in the city. So we as community have come together to do this community-initiated charter process, which the way that works is we get it on the ballot through a citizen petition process. So we have to have, we're trying to get 20,000 signatures in order to submit it to the Charter Commission to get it on the ballot. And we've chosen this route because we think it creates community buy-in from the beginning and makes sure that everyone gets involved in the process in the beginning. And what we've found, so one of my roles is training people and explaining this very obtuse, confusing process that is our charter process. And people are actually really excited and hungry for it, to the point where over the summer when these commission hearings were happening, there was people were eating popcorn and watching these charter commission meetings and becoming aware of how unelected and unaccountable the charter commissioners are, and how we need to change the charter in order to be able to have the democratic participation that we want in how we shape safety in our city. And this is the very first step to get there.
So talk to me a little bit more, and maybe you could both jump in on this. What's the makeup of the Charter Commission? What sort of folks are normally placed on it? And and sort of why are they the be all and end all when it comes to these sorts of decisions? Although you did mention it's not quite a be all and end all, because technically it seems like the council could say, I don't care about your recommendation. Is that right?
Yes. So the reason that the Charter Commission's actually lack of action was so final was because of this time period that they have. Normally, and this year, what will happen with either of these proposals is the Charter Commission will review and they'll send back a recommendation to the council. Either, yes, you should put this on the ballot and send it to voters. No, we don't think you should. Or they can propose alternate language that would tweak our proposal for the council version, not for the citizen version. So, the Charter Commission is appointed by a judge. They have other important roles in our community, like redistricting the city council districts. That's coming up very soon after the next census. It's fair to say they're very unrepresentative of the city demographically. Older, by and large, almost all of them are white. I think probably live in not a totally dispersed geographic, fully representative parts of our city. So I think there's a lot of room for diversity within that commission. They have in the past, as a body, put forward some effort when they redistricted the council last time. Before I took office, they created a subcommittee with community appointees that was more diverse in order to inform the council redistricting process. So I think there are opportunities in how they're working in order to create more space for community voices, and certainly more opportunity for diversity in the body itself.
So I want to move to the text of the charter amendment itself. Because basically what you're doing is, there's this requirement, you're taking it out and replacing it with something new. But what I'm seeing in this amendment is that it requires within it that there be law enforcement, but it doesn't necessarily require, there has to be social workers in there or any sort of other thing like that. And so I'm sure a lot of council members, community members are sort of wondering, how do we make sure that this new agency doesn't end up being, overtaken by the law enforcement within it? Like, how do you prevent this new agency, assuming all of this gets passed, how do you prevent it from being basically a new police department? And so I really want to ask both of you this question, and I'll start with Sheila because there's a potential that you could actually have a say in this because of your mayoral campaign as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the differences between the council-initiated amendment and the community-initiated one. They're complementary, but in the community-initiated one, we went through a long community feedback process before developing the language that we put on the petition. And we decided that instead of having a subdivision of law enforcement, which is in the council-initiated one, which is similar to what happened this summer, we changed it to just being one level where law enforcement could be used as one tool among many in the department, but don't have their own sub-department. So that's helpful in that we know from the history of policing that police departments will do all they can to preserve their power, right? And by restructuring the department so that all types of employees and the skills and functions they have are held equally, then we can kind of chip away at that impunity that exists under the current department structure, when really, as we saw this summer, MPD went rogue. They went rogue after the murder of George Floyd. And I remember going out to the very first protest on Chicago Avenue the day after George Floyd was killed and thinking, oh, MPD is going to be on their best behavior right now, right? One of their coworkers just killed someone. And I was standing on the street and just totally shocked when they came out in droves with the big bear mace cans and their wooden batons, and just really aggravating. And they were totally unaccountable to anyone. So we have to chip away at that impunity. And I think one way to do that is by changing the departmental structure as well.
Councilmember, same question for you. How do you sort of take into account that sort of nature of law enforcement within this new division?
I think the reality of how change happens in local government means that it will be incremental, it will happen over time, and it will be informed by community. And there's another charter amendment on the ballot potentially this fall that would actually strengthen the power of our mayor to make decisions that I think is very harmful to that iterative process that we see when members of our community from across the city are able to engage directly with their council member, especially in the context of very uneven voting turnout in our city, giving much more power to some neighborhoods and electing the mayor typically than you see in the council, where we have equal representation across the city. We've done other types of structural change to make government do a better job of meeting current community needs. They didn't all need a charter change, but in many ways, city governments across the country, including Minneapolis, are shifting how we structure our government in order to better serve our community. We've changed our regulatory services and city attorneys' departments to prevent evictions for renters and make sure people are in safe and stable housing. We have changed our civil rights department to add a division of labor standards to enforce new worker protection laws. We've added staff in our public works departments to design streets so that they're safe and accessible for all users. And so this is a really important issue, public safety, keeping our community safe. And it is one example of many of ways that Minneapolis government and local governments around the country are evolving to meet current needs and to do better, to acknowledge and repair the harms that have been caused in so many aspects of public life, be it transportation or racist zoning laws or police violence. We have a lot of work to do to create the equitable Minneapolis that people believe in and value in our city. And restructuring government is one tool. But, as Sheila said, as we hear from our constituents, the details really matter. And the truth is in Minneapolis, we are in the middle of a really tough conversation about public safety. And people have really different life experiences that inform how they feel about our current system of safety and what it could become. And so our job as leaders, whether community leaders or elected leaders, is to listen, is to help facilitate folks hearing from each other and sharing their life experiences, to center the voices of folks who are most affected by both police violence and community violence, our Black communities, our communities of color in Minneapolis, and find that iterative way of making progress that really centers those voices and brings everyone along together.
So, Councilmember, I want to hone in on one thing that you just said, which is sort of you talked about sort of the danger of putting too much power into the hands of the mayor. And so I want to talk a little bit about the mayor. And I talked a little bit at the top about sort of his recent action to threaten to veto the whole budget if his funding demands weren't met. And you've actually tweeted about his interference in the budget process. So talk to us a little bit more about the competing visions between Mayor Frye and the City Council when it comes to the future of the MPD.
Yes, so in Minneapolis, we are a community, like I said, that has a lot of shared values. The political spectrum in Minneapolis is maybe narrower than other cities. There's a lot of agreement and there's a lot of common ground. And we've been able to draw on that to make really huge changes in lots of areas of our city's government, in our budgets, in all of the other examples I gave. On public safety, there is disagreement. And, the mayor has been very clear. He ran against an incumbent talking about her failures to stop police violence, what he perceived as her failures to keep community members safe. And both problems are dramatically worse now than they were then. At the time, as a council member, he was very clear that the mayor is in charge of the police department. That is what our charter says. That is the truth and the reality. So when the police department was completely out of control after the police killed George Floyd, it was either because the mayor did not command them to de-escalate, or because they didn't listen. And that escalation by law enforcement is what led to complete chaos in our city, leaving people feeling completely abandoned by their government. My neighborhood, my neighbors, our neighborhood organizations, local businesses were creating safety networks and bucket brigades to try to put out fires, because after the police escalated, the city just lost control. And I think we need to have a really clear shared understanding of what led to that and the role of police violence and escalating police violence in creating the conditions that led to even worse safety in our city. So looking back and saying, the problem here, the police report directly to the mayor in our city. I think folks think we have more authority, that we could use our legislative process to change use of force laws or change training procedures, but we don't under our charter. And when the city council has the opportunity to act, like when the State Department of Human Rights brought a lawsuit against our police department for patterns and practices of racial discrimination, just 4 days later, the city council unanimously approved a temporary restraining order to implement reforms that they asked as part of that lawsuit. So we have taken swift and decisive action when given the chance, when we have the authority to do so. And I think that's because we're hearing from constituents from around the city who are demanding change. And again, not coming from all different places, with lots of different things to sort out in the details, but a clear mandate for change.
And I do want to sort of hone in on one thing that you said, just so our viewers can really grasp this. And again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's when it comes to policing, when it comes to other agencies, city councils can pass laws and sort of direct what they can and cannot do. But for the most part, the only person who can legislate the police is the mayor, is this one mayor. That's right?
Yes, and it happens behind closed doors, right? So when we pass an ordinance, a minimum wage law or renter protections, we propose it, it goes to the public, people see it, there's a public hearing, folks can turn out and share their opinions in public. We have a voting record. It's all clear and transparent and in the public. And with this chain of command with the police, even for policy issues, reporting only to the mayor, it's all done behind closed doors. So the mayor and the police chief will have a press conference and announce some change, and it's hard to track if it even really happened. Members of the community aren't invited into a conversation about what does our use of force policy say? How are officers trained? Does it make me feel safer? Does it seem appropriate? We're often able to draw on the expertise of lots of experts in our community, whether lived experience or educational expertise. That's missing when you have that closed door process that is in place now. And I don't think people know that. I think based on the conversations that we have with constituents and the feedback we get, most people in Minneapolis think that we have control over the police department's policies, their operations. So I think sometimes this is framed as like a power grab for the council, but we're trying to step up and meet the moment and deliver what our constituents are asking us to do that we don't currently have authority under our charter to do. And this particular mayor is fighting back overtly, clearly at every turn, very incremental changes in our system of public safety, threatening to veto the budget when we're investing in mental health response, shifting report-only calls to out of 911 to our 311 system. One of the changes we made is during the day when you call for a parking complaint, a regulatory services staff person goes out in a parking enforcement car and gives you a ticket, and at night the police do. And we're just making it so that those regulatory services staff are the 24-hour operation for parking complaints. It's a small change. And even these things are facing these common sense, budgetarily efficient changes are facing opposition. And it's holding us back from delivering on that promise to really engage our community in the deep work of shaping our system of safety in the future. It's unnecessary because there is so much common ground. And I am hopeful that as we move forward into this next election, that our community speaks, decisively about their hopes for our future, and that giving folks a chance to weigh in on opening up the door to more tools for safety will help folks imagine what's possible.
Sheila, I would love for you to jump in here, because in addition to your organizing work around this issue, you have also thrown and I alluded to this earlier, you've thrown your hat into the ring and into the city's mayoral race. So talk to us a little bit about what vision the mayor should have when it comes to framing public safety in the city.
I think what needs to happen and why I am running is because we need to expand the conversation from police to safety, right? Because right now what's happening is policing is being used to polarize people and saying, okay, defund the police, all the police are going to be gone overnight. Now we have this crisis of crime happening. But when we talk about safety and what makes you feel safe, we have to start talking about making sure you have a place to live and can afford your rent. We have to talk about being able to have access to mental health care. We have to talk about youth programming and making sure our youth are being taken care of. We have to talk about racial, social, and economic justice. And our community is hungry for those conversations too. And frankly, I think it is insulting to the intellect of our community to try to create this fear-mongering around policing, police going to be gone overnight, all of this stuff that's happening. And as mayor, as a candidate for mayor, my area of expertise is in policing, and broadening it to looking at safety, developing alternatives, decriminalization, all of that. And I want to bring that to the city, because what we're seeing happen is this call for these reforms that we've tried over and over again in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has been the poster child for police reform, whether it comes to implicit bias training, body cameras, use of force policies, all of these we've had, and it still didn't change what happened this summer, right? And so we need to change where our priorities are in terms of how we spend money, and putting real money behind it too, and political will. So for example, this summer, the council passed a resolution saying that racism is a public health crisis. So how does that translate into our budget? How does that translate into what our mayor is doing right now? All of these things I think we need to consider. And I've had really great conversations with folks too who are ready for a mayor who has a different theory of change.
So one last question for both of you. Right now we're also experiencing the ongoing trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd. So curious to hear from both of you how you think that will impact the momentum for overhauling public safety in Minneapolis. And Councilmember, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, first I'll say that if you walked through Minneapolis right now, you would see barbed wire and fencing. There's been months of preparation for law enforcement and National Guard to respond to potential unrest like we saw last summer. And during a presentation to the city council, a number of my colleagues and I asked a lot of questions about that prioritization. And I think the way that the mayor and many appointed department heads and city leaders are thinking about safety is very clear in the city's preparations for the trial, which emphasized law enforcement, which emphasized force as a solution to problems. And until very recently, after feedback from council, and I'm sure others, now includes some modest funding for community-based organizations to support our community through what is a very difficult time. We know that justice is hard won if it happens in our justice system. And there's a real possibility that many members of our community will be heartbroken and angry about the results of this trial. I hope there is justice in this trial. It's just getting underway with jury selection. But we need to be ready to support our community through whatever comes. And that needs to include support. It needs to include an acknowledgement of the city's role in causing the harm that happened last summer with police killing George Floyd, with the police violence that followed. And so always leading with force, with fences and barbed wire, is sending the wrong message to our community. So along, again, with many of my colleagues, I have been pushing the city to expand, to think differently about safety, to lead with compassion, to not always go to force as the solution to problems, and to really listen to every member of our community. There are folks who feel safer when there are police around, and we need to prepare better than we did last summer when so many fires devastated small businesses. But the idea that we can police our way out of police violence is ridiculous, and it isn't reflective of what we're hearing from our community. And we should be leading with that compassion, leading with that acknowledgement of the harm that the city itself has caused, and investing in our community members who are the ones seeing each other through this difficult time.
Sheila, I'll have you take us out by answering that last question, how you think the trial is going to impact the way people view public safety in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what Council President Bender said, in that we are unlikely to see justice no matter what the trial verdict is, right? That will not bring back George Floyd. In Minneapolis, we had a police officer who was convicted of killing a member here. He's in prison now, and that hasn't created justice, right? That hasn't changed the system of policing. And so I think what we need as a community is an assurance that we can move to change something so much bigger, right? The charter change is a part of that process. That's saying we're going to change the whole system, and we need reparations, right? If there's $1 million to put up a barbed wire fence, I want to see $1 million put into community. Or at the very least, instead of deploying the National Guard, go out to those protests and give hot food to everyone who's out there and put up bathrooms. That's how you create a peaceful protest, is by feeding people and showing them that you care, not having people with automatic weapons standing behind fences. And so I think it's up to our city leaders, our state leaders, to show us that they care right now, because even the beginning of jury selection has shown us that we can't have faith within the system, and we have to change the system in order to get to peace.
Well, thank you both so much for being with us today, and for all of the work that you're both doing to make those structural changes to the system. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as right now, jury selection is happening in the trial of Derek Chauvin. We've seen how what's really necessary in the eyes of organizers and the eyes of people who have been impacted by over-policing in Minneapolis, that what's really necessary is structural change. And that's what's being proposed right now. And it's what people have been demanding since the killing of George Floyd, and even since before that, given the violence that the MPD has caused in the past. And so this November will be a test for voters as to whether or not that change will come forward, whether or not there will be a charter amendment, and whether or not voters will vote yes on it. And tomorrow we'll see whether or not City Council will also vote yes on that charter amendment as well. And as our guests have told us, there have been obstacles to enacting structural change within Minneapolis. But despite those obstacles, there is still a path forward in Minneapolis for a new model of public safety, one that is concerned with taking care of people rather than responding with violence to societal ills. And if this charter amendment and signature campaigns are successful, voters in the city could have the chance to make their voices heard on this subject as early as this year. That's all the time we have for today. Continue to follow us on The Appeal on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.